Subscribe to Love, Lies, and Cheating. Now let me tell you a story. I learned the truth on a Tuesday afternoon in a building that smelled like lemon cleaner and old carpet. And the first thing I remember thinking was that betrayal always hides in places that look harmless, because nothing about the hallway felt dramatic or threatening. It felt organized, neutral, quiet, like secrets were expected there and accommodated without judgment. I did not wake up that morning searching for answers. I woke up believing I was still inside a marriage that needed patience. Not investigation time, not confrontation. But by the time I stood there waiting for an elevator, I already knew the neighbor was not a stranger. And I already knew my husband had been living next to a version of himself I had never met. His name was Caleb Rowe. And I say it plainly now because names matter, once you understand how deliberately they were kept from you. Caleb Rowe was the kind of man people describe as friendly, because friendly is the word people use when someone makes them comfortable without earning trust. He waved, often remembered small details, spoke like familiarity came naturally to him, and that alone should have unsettled me. But I told myself I was imagining things, because new places heighten awareness, and marriage makes you sensitive to change. And yet stability does not make your chest tighten when your husband hears a name. Stability does not make him adjust his routines without explanation. Stability does not make you feel like a guest in your own living room. When I say I learned the truth that Tuesday, I do not mean everything snapped into focus. There was no single revelation, no dramatic confession. What happened instead was slower and worse. The last explanation I'd been using finally collapsed under its own weight, and I could no longer pretend I was confused instead of lied to. The building itself was small, unremarkable neutral art on the wall's doors without personality. A receptionist trained to smile without curiosity. And it felt like the perfect place for decisions people intended to keep separate from the rest of their lives. I was there because Caleb had finally said something he did not mean to say, a sentence delivered casually, like it was harmless. Like he had forgotten for a moment that I was not supposed to know what he knew. He asked how I was holding up, and when I asked what he meant, he smiled and said he admired how calm I stayed considering what Grant had done back then. And 2 words rearranged an entire year back then, because suddenly the street around us felt too bright, too quiet, too ordinary for what it carried. Grant Hart, my husband, 38, the man I built my adult life around, did not cheat on me in the way people expect. There was no obvious affair, no late-night messages, no dramatic proof. What he did was quieter. He withheld a chapter of himself so completely that our marriage became a structure built around an absence. And Caleb knew exactly what lived inside that absence. Long before I did not confront Grant immediately, because I already understood how he handled pressure. He did not confess. He redirected, he reframed, he smoothed the surface and made you doubt your own memory. If I wanted the truth, I needed more than emotion. I needed reconstruction. So I rewound the year carefully, slowly, the way you replay a conversation. You know you misunderstood the first time. It started with the move. Grant wanted it more than I did, framed it as a fresh start, a quieter neighborhood, a smarter investment. His logic was sound, but his urgency was not. And I ignored that, because urgency can look like hope. When you want to believe things are improving, the neighborhood felt safe, tree-lined, quiet, the kind of place people choose when they believe they are done running. Grant liked it immediately, and I took that as a sign. I needed Caleb appeared within days. introduced himself while Grant was unloading boxes, smiled easily, spoke comfortably stood, like he belonged there, and when Grant turned and saw him, his body reacted before his face could catch up. A pause, a tightening of recognition. Grant never acknowledged aloud. He smiled quickly, shook Caleb's hand and moved the conversation along, and I noticed because I knew Grant's body language better than his words. Over the next weeks, Caleb became part of the Scenery Trash Day mailbox driveway. He was always present without being intrusive. He knew details he should not have known. Grant's coffee habits, his early mornings, his preferences. Caleb spoke in statements, not questions, familiarity, not curiosity. Grant brushed it off, but his tone sharpened. His routines changed. He left earlier, closed blinds, parked differently, and I told myself it was stress from the move because that explanation asked less of me than the truth. Then came the package addressed to a name I did not recognize but tied to our home. Grant reacted, instantly grabbed it, disappeared into the garage later. I found the label torn in the trash. The city printed beneath the shredded name was one Grant had lived in before we met. And the next day, Caleb mentioned that same city casually, and coincidence stopped feeling harmless. I began looking quietly old photos, archived emails, shared files, and found a photograph from years ago at a gathering Grant had described as work. Caleb stood in the background, arm resting on Grant's shoulder like it belonged there, and memory rearranged itself instantly. Suspicion is lonely because you cannot share it without sounding unstable, and you cannot ignore it without betraying yourself. Grant sensed my distance and smoothed the surface. Cooked dinner, suggested date night, spoke kindly. Calm was his strategy, calm without truth. The document that removed my last doubt was hidden in his desk, a lease agreement, a small monthly payment, the address of the building that smelled like lemon cleaner. The name matched the package, and I understood Grant had been living under an altered version of himself for a long time. And that was when I stopped asking whether the neighbor was a stranger and started asking how long my husband had been planning for me. Not to know I did not confront Grant right away because confrontation would have given him time to prepare, and I had already learned that preparation was his strength. Grant survived by staying one step ahead of consequence, and I needed him exactly where he was, unaware and unguarded. So instead, I watched him the way you watch someone. When you realize they have been performing for you for a long time, I listened to what he emphasized and what he avoided. I paid attention to how often he mentioned work without detail, how often he spoke in outcomes rather than processes, how often he described success without describing effort. Those patterns had always been there, but now they rearranged themselves into something recognizable. Grant liked to be impressive, he always had. He admired people who won, admired results, admired confidence that looked effortless, and when I thought about it, that admiration explained more than I wanted it to explain. It explained how he spoke about the past without specifics. It explained why he avoided old contacts and why he never talked about the years before we met with any texture. Those years were always summarized, never lived in out loud, and I had accepted that because I thought privacy and secrecy were the same thing. I began reconstructing the chapter he never told me about, not through his words, but through fragments left behind, digital traces, documents, photographs, and the quiet way Caleb spoke like he already knew the ending. Grant and Caleb met years before me through local business circles, the kind of rooms where ambition feels louder than caution. Grant thrived in those spaces. He could make half-formed ideas sound inevitable. He could speak with certainty even when guessing. And Caleb believed him because Caleb believed systems matter. Caleb believed if you build something correctly and document it properly, effort will protect you. They built something together quickly. Not a large company, not a public venture, something private, something built on trust and speed. Grant handled vision. Caleb handled credibility. Introductions, relationships, the part that made people feel safe. Money moved through the structure faster than oversight could follow. And Grant framed every questionable decision as temporary a bridge, a necessary adjustment until success caught up with intention. That is how people step over lines without feeling like they cross them. They tell themselves they will return once things stabilize. But things did not stabilize, they accelerated. And when acceleration outpaces accountability, collapse becomes inevitable. The first sign was not dramatic. It was small discrepancies, projections, not aligning deposits, arriving late invoices that did not match agreements. Caleb noticed because Caleb cared about structure. He asked questions and Grant reassured him. Grant was very good at reassurance. He could speak calmly while chaos spread underneath, and he framed Caleb's concern as distrust made him feel like the problem for asking that kind of manipulation works best on people who value fairness because it turns accountability into guilt. When the venture began to fail, Grant reacted by moving faster, by shifting money, by holding appearances together rather than addressing damage. Caleb began documenting, saving emails, keeping records, trying to protect himself and the people he had brought in. Grant noticed and became more careful. Meetings without follow-up decisions, without paper trails, conversations that disappeared as soon as they happened. When an investor demanded withdrawal and there was nothing to withdraw. The lie became external, and once outsiders are involved, denial stops working. Caleb had to respond. He had to explain. He had to choose between loyalty to Grant and responsibility to the people who trusted him. Caleb chose responsibility. Grant called that betrayal. Caleb called it survival. The community chose the easiest narrative. They blamed the person whose name they recognized, whose roots were visible, whose reputation had been leveraged to build trust. Grant had already begun to move away, already begun rewriting himself, already begun exiting the version of his life that included consequence. Caleb stayed and absorbed what followed. Not just financial loss, but social damage, relationships, strained conversations that went quiet, invitations that stopped coming. Evidence existed, but evidence moves slowly while reputation collapses quickly. Grant built a new narrative, framed himself as a visionary undermined by caution. And people believed him because belief is easier than complexity. And I met him inside that rebuilt story, never knowing what had been edited out. Caleb could not rebuild as easily. He stayed near the same people, the same places, the same judgments. He spent years repairing damage that was never fully his to carry. And that kind of experience does not make you louder. It makes you patient. It teaches you that time can be leverage. It teaches you that proximity can be pressure. And when Caleb finally found where Grant had landed, finally saw him living comfortably inside a new life built on omission, he did not confront him immediately. He waited. That waiting was deliberate. Caleb did not want chaos. He wanted acknowledgement. He wanted the story corrected. And he wanted Grant to feel the weight of being seen again. That was why he moved next door, why he became part of routine, why he never raised his voice, why he smiled without warmth, why he spoke like familiarity was inevitable. Grant felt it immediately. even if he pretended not to. Because people who run from consequence recognize witnesses on instinct. That was why Grant's routines changed, why he avoided windows, why he reacted to a package like it was dangerous because it was not the paper that frightened him. It was recognition. It was the understanding that the chapter he buried was no longer buried. It was standing on the same street waiting. I realized then that the neighbor was not intruding into our marriage, the past was, and my husband had invited it by never paying what it cost. Once I understood the shape of what Grant had done years before, I could no longer look at our marriage the same way because the lie was not confined to the past. It had shaped the present in ways I had never questioned. I began to review our life together the way you review a contract after realizing one clause was deliberately hidden. I looked at the early years, the way trust formed. How easily I accepted his reluctance to talk about certain periods. How often I filled in blanks for him without being asked, because I wanted to believe I was respecting his privacy rather than enabling his secrecy. Grant had always spoken about the future with confidence and the past with efficiency. He summarized rather than described. He closed chapters without inviting questions, and I mistook that for emotional maturity. I told myself not everyone wants to relive old versions of themselves. I told myself some people simply move forward, but moving forward without accountability leaves shadows. And I had been living alongside those shadows without recognizing them as such. There were moments I had dismissed that returned with clarity once I knew what to look for. The way Grant avoided certain social circles, the way he changed the subject when business ethics came up, the way he admired people who reinvented themselves without ever asking what they were reinventing from. I realized how often he framed success as proof of character rather than outcome, and how dangerous that belief can be when someone has already learned how to succeed without consequence. The waiting period before Caleb acted was the most destabilizing part, because nothing outwardly changed, and yet everything felt different. Every morning carried weight, every sound felt loaded. The ordinary rituals of our life took on a sense of surveillance. And I understood that the real cruelty of omission is not the moment it is discovered, but the length of time someone lets you live inside it because it is convenient for them. Grant tried to maintain normalcy. He spoke, carefully touched me, gently suggested plans for the future, and every gesture felt rehearsed, because I now understood rehearsal was his survival strategy. He did not lie impulsively. He curated, he smoothed. He waited until friction passed, and that realization hurt more than anger would have because it meant the man I loved had been practicing absence long before I ever noticed it. I thought about how trust forms not in grand moments but in repetition, how you believe someone because they have been consistent, not because they have been transparent. Grant had been consistent in the way he withheld, and I had mistaken that consistency for safety. I realized then that trust is not built by how calm someone keeps things, but by how willing they are to let you see what unsettles them. And Grant had never let me see what unsettled him, because what unsettled him was the possibility of being known fully. Caleb's presence sharpened that understanding, because Caleb did not demand anything openly. He did not knock on our door shouting accusations. He did not threaten exposure. He simply existed as a reminder that the past was still accessible, and that was enough to unravel the life Grant had built on distance. Caleb understood something Grant never did. That silence can be louder than confrontation, and that proximity can do what anger cannot. I began to wonder what Grant would choose if forced to choose between exposure and preservation, whether he would finally tell the truth, or whether he would look for another exit, another version of himself to inhabit another life to step into, without paying what the last one cost me. The most frightening realization was that I did not know the answer, and I should have known the answer, because marriage is supposed to give you access to that certainty. There was a night when Grant fell asleep beside me, and I stayed awake listening to his breathing, steady, familiar, and I felt the distance between us more clearly than ever, not because he was unfaithful in body, but because he had been unfaithful to reality. He had chosen which parts of himself I was allowed to know, and which parts I was expected to live beside unknowingly, and that choice removed my ability to consent to the life we were building. The next morning, I saw Caleb again standing at the edge of his driveway, watching our house with the patience of someone who has already waited long enough. He did not look angry. He did not look vindictive. He looked resolved, and I understood then that whatever happened next would not be chaotic. It would be deliberate, and that terrified me more than any outburst could have. I asked Grant that evening what he planned to do, and he told me he hoped Caleb would move on. That time would dull the need for correction, and that answer told me everything I needed to know. Grant still believed avoidance was a strategy rather than a delay. He still believed silence could protect him, and I realized that if I stayed, I would be participating in that silence. I would be choosing comfort over clarity, and I had already paid too much for that choice without knowing it. The question was no longer whether Grant's past would surface. It was whether I would remain tied to the version of him that required my ignorance to survive. And that realization sat heavy in my chest, because loving someone does not protect you from being harmed by them when harm is built quietly over time. When I went to bed that night, I understood that the folder Caleb held was not the true threat. The true threat was what I would do, once the truth was no longer avoidable, and whether I would finally choose to stop living inside a story I did not agree to carry. I stopped waiting for Grant to decide what to do, because waiting had already cost me too much, and I realized something important in that space between knowledge and action. Silence is not neutral. Silence is a choice, and I had been surrounded by choices made on my behalf for years. Without my consent, the calm Grant maintained was not peace, it was control. And I finally understood that the life I thought I was living only worked as long as I did not ask for its full terms. The day Caleb walked toward our house with the folder in his hand, I did not feel panic the way I expected to feel. What I felt instead was clarity, because the waiting had already done its work. The fear had already passed, and in its place was a kind of steadiness that surprised me. I watched him from the window, noticing how unremarkable he looked, how ordinary his steps were, how little drama existed in the moment, and I realized then that the most devastating truths rarely arrive loudly. They arrive quietly with paperwork and patience. Grant saw him too. I could tell by the way his body stiffened before he said anything, the way his breath changed, the way his eyes stopped moving like he was bracing for impact. And I wondered how many times in his life he had felt this exact sensation, the moment when consequence finally caught up with him, and whether he had always found a way out, or whether this time was different, because this time I was watching fully awake. Caleb did not knock right away. He stood on the porch looking at the door like he was giving Grant time to choose whether he would open it himself or force Caleb to do it for him. And that pause told me everything about Caleb's intention. He did not want spectacle. He wanted acknowledgement. He wanted the story corrected. He wanted the truth to exist in the open, even if it damaged everyone involved, because damage had already been done and silence only concentrated it. Grant turned to me, and in his face I saw something I had never seen before. Not guilt, not fear, but calculation. The same calculation that must have guided him years ago when he decided which version of himself to keep and which to abandon. And in that moment, I knew with certainty that if I stayed silent now, I would be choosing to live alongside that calculation forever. I would be accepting a marriage where truth was conditional and integrity was negotiable. I told Grant I would not protect him from his past anymore, and the words felt simple but heavy, because they removed the last illusion he'd been relying on, that my love would function as a shield. And for the first time since I met him, Grant looked at me like I was no longer predictable, like I was no longer part of the structure he had built to keep himself safe. When the door opened, Caleb spoke calmly and handed Grant the folder. Without stepping inside, he did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He did not demand. He simply said it was time. And that was enough, because Grant already knew what time meant. It meant the end of delay. It meant the end of omission. It meant the end of the life he had been living on borrowed trust. I did not need to read what was inside the folder to understand what it contained. Documentation timelines, proof the kind that does not shout but does not disappear. Either the kind that forces decisions rather than arguments. And I realized then that the most powerful thing Caleb had done was not moving next door. It was waiting until Grant had something to lose that he could not walk away from without being seen. After Caleb left, Grant sat at the table holding the folder like it weighed more than paper. And for the first time, he did not try to explain himself. He did not reframe. He did not smooth. He simply sat there, and in that stillness, I saw the cost of building a life on omission. It eventually leaves you with nothing left to say. I told Grant I needed the truth, not fragments, not justifications, not narratives, but the full unedited version, and I told him I needed it whether or not it saved us. Because I could not continue living inside a marriage where my understanding of reality depended on his convenience. And that was the moment something irreversible happened. Not because of Caleb, not because of the folder, but because I finally named the boundary. I should have named years ago. The truth came slowly, unevenly, and it hurt in ways I had not anticipated, because it was not one betrayal. It was a pattern, a philosophy, a way of moving through life that prioritized survival over honesty. And I understood then that loving someone does not obligate you to carry what they refuse to face. By the end of the night, I knew that whether Grant chose to sign the statement or not, whether his career survived or collapsed, whether Caleb felt restored or not, my life could not continue in the same shape, because the stranger in my marriage was no longer hidden and I could not unknow what I knew. The neighbor was never a stranger. The stranger was the man I married. And the truth was never about the past. It was about who I would allow myself to be once the silence was gone. Don't forget to subscribe to Love, Lies, and Cheating. Until we meet again.